in sports was unfortunately necessary. Just this month, the Biden administration moved to advance a radical regulatory scheme which forbids bans on transgender athletes under Title IX. Twisting the meaning of law to suit progressive ideas at the expense of fairness and opportunity for girls and women in sports is simply wrong. This bill shouldn't be partisan. Its premise is simple: recognizing biology. Girls and women participating in sports exemplify the hard work, grit, and passion it takes to play. We want the integrity of that competition upheld. Our second measure is HJ Resolution 42, a joint resolution of disapproval of a law passed by the District of Columbia Council. Under the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, laws passed by the D.C. Council are subject to congressional review and will not take effect if Congress passes and the President signs into law a joint resolution of disapproval. In this case, HJ Res 42 would disapprove of the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Amendment Act of 2022, another radical piece of legislation that will make it harder for the District of Columbia to recruit and retain police officers at a time when crime is skyrocketing across the nation's capital. If allowed to become law, the act in question would place undue burdens on the D.C. police force, hampering their ability to perform law enforcement duties, as well as create mechanisms for activists and anti-police groups to unjustifiably target individual officers. The D.C. Metro Police Department is already struggling to retain officers, with almost 1,200 officers, nearly a third of the force, departing over the last 3 years. At the same time, crime rates have spiked, and overall crime rates up 23% from 2022 to 23, homicide rates up 31% in 2023, and motor vehicle theft up a whopping 107% in 2023. With safety a growing concern in the nation's capital and the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department already in dire straits, this is hardly the time for the D.C. Council to pursue another piece of legislation that will make it harder to recruit or retain officers and limit law enforcement tools vital to public and officer safety. D.C. Residents have the same expectations of public safety as do citizens of any other municipality in America, and it's appropriate for Congress to exercise its constitutional and statutory authority to prevent this misguided bill from becoming law. I now yield to our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he cares to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's great to see you. It's great to see my colleagues. Mr. Chairman, we've all had plenty of time to talk to our constituents over the last 2 weeks, to get out into our communities and take stock of the challenges facing America. And yet, out of all the issues in the world, House Republicans decided that on our very first day back, our very first bill would be a trans bullying bill. More division, more extremism, more MAGA culture wars. You know, when I was home in Massachusetts, this issue didn't come up at all. Not a single person brought this issue up to me. Republicans are obsessed with attacking and bullying trans people. It's cruel. Frankly, it's creepy. And it's a really rotten thing to do. I'm sick and tired of the other side picking on vulnerable populations. Enough already. Some say this bill is about keeping kids safe. So let's talk about safety. Nothing kills more kids in America than gun violence. 20 students at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown. 17 students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. 19 students at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde. Most recently, 3 9-year-olds at the Covenant School in Nashville. And just this weekend, another 4 kids at a Sweet 16 birthday party in Alabama. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and teens, more than car crashes, more than cancer. Kids and parents are terrified their school will be next. And Republicans are worried about deciding who can be on the track team? I mean, give me a break. Is this some kind of sick joke? What's next? A bill about who can play together during recess? You know, I hear my colleagues talk a lot about the weaponizing of the federal government. So let's talk about weaponizing the federal government. We are advancing a bill here that literally empowers the federal government to reach into local soccer teams and kick individuals off. Apparently, the GOP thinks Congress knows better than the NCAA, better than local school districts, better than parents, better than student athletes, and better than school psychologists who say this bill, and I quote, will significantly harm the mental health of transgender students. Sounds like a lot of weaponization to me. Nothing in this legislation ensures that sports will be more fair or more safe. In fact, and I have to say again, this bill is just creepy. Enforcing it may require that girls and young women answer personal questions about their menstrual cycle and physical development. Female student athletes could even be subjected to inspection by adults who they may not even know, as young as in their preteen years. So that's what we're debating here today, whether or not young kids should have to get their genitals inspected or else they get kicked off the swim team. As a parent who had 2 kids play middle school and high school sports, I am disgusted. I'm disgusted by the real-world consequences of this bill. If signed into law, it would lead to increased hate against trans kids. It would lead to suicide, all because Republican leadership is obsessed with pushing their creepy MAGA culture wars onto our kids. The bottom line is this bill should not come to the House floor. And then we have H.J. Res 42, yet another law about Washington, D.C. I just have to ask, why are Republicans so obsessed with Washington? Why don't they pass laws that help the rest of the country, that help their own districts? If they're so obsessed with the D.C. City Council, why don't you run for D.C. City Council? Instead, the self-proclaimed party of local government wants to overrule 13 democratically elected local city councilors and D.C.'s 700,000 voters in another massive power grab. And by the way, if you want to combat crime, I advise my Republican friends to look in the mirror. Speaker McCarthy's hometown of Bakersfield is the 4th most dangerous place to live in the United States of America. This bill would ease up on officers with misconduct records, make it more difficult for the public to view body cam footage, allow police to use chokeholds and other deadly uses of force, even in cases where it's not absolutely necessary. This has nothing to do with fighting crime. House Republicans are getting rid of important transparency and safety measures in a city they weren't even elected to represent. So give me a break. Out of all the problems that our constituents are facing right now, these are the issues on the House Republicans' agenda: meddling with D.C. laws and bullying trans kids. Meanwhile, House Democrats and President Biden are working to improve the everyday lives of Americans, to enhance public safety, to protect kids, to cut inflation, lower costs for families, support workers, and safeguard Social Security and Medicare. 60% of Americans disapprove of how Republicans in Congress are handling their job 100 days in. And if you look at the bills we are considering here today, it is no wonder why. There's plenty for me to say, and I anticipate a lengthy back and forth today. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank you. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, which is Chairwoman Fox and Representative Takano from the Committee on Education and Workforce. Dr. Fox, always good to have you back. Welcome to the Rules Committee, and we'd welcome your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McGovern, members of the committee. It's always great to be back at the Rules Committee. The Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, H.R. 734, is a common sense piece of legislation. Let me point out that it is barely 1 page long, which is the way legislation ought to be written, in my opinion. Very short bill, and I may come back to that in a minute. It aims to protect the integrity of women's sports and ensure that they remain fair for all female athletes. The issue of fairness in women's sports has become contentious in recent years with the increasing participation of male athletes in women's competitions. It's crucial that we ensure that female athletes are not unfairly disadvantaged by males participating against them. Female athletes have fought hard to gain recognition and respect for their achievements, and they should not be undermined by unfair advantages or discrimination. Allowing males to compete in women's sports does just that. H.R. 734 seeks to address this by prohibiting federal funding to institutions that allow males to compete in women's sports, teams, or events. It is an indisputable fact that the average man has certain physical advantages over women in sports. Men tend to have larger muscle mass, greater bone density, more lung capacity, larger heart size, and higher levels of testosterone, all of which give them a competitive edge over female athletes. These advantages are not only present in the average man and woman, but in world-class athletes as well. A male student at the University of Pennsylvania competed for 3 years on the men's swim team and then decided to compete on the women's team. The world watched the student go from an average swimmer on the men's team to a record-shattering swimmer on the women's team. It's unfair, plain and simple. Democrats say that cases like this are so rare that they should be ignored. They say our criticisms are rooted in transphobia or discrimination. That couldn't be further from the truth. Republicans recognize the reality of biological differences between boys and girls, men and women. Allowing any single girl to lose a roster spot, a place on the podium, or a scholarship to a male is one too many. With the interest of our nation's young girls in mind, Congress should take up H.R. 734. Passage of this bill will send a message to young girls and women everywhere that their contributions to sports are valued and respected and that they are entitled to the same opportunities and recognition as their male counterparts. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Representative Takano, welcome. You're recognized for your testimony.
Good evening, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. I speak in opposition to H.R. 734, the more aptly named Politics Over Participation Act. We can all agree on the need to address the challenges facing our education system, issues such as gun violence, academic achievement gaps, and the lack of mental health support for students. These are all serious challenges that demand serious action. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues have used their first 100 days in the majority to pursue a radical education agenda that prioritizes political points over students' success and safety. Last month, House Republicans unilaterally passed a bill that allows a vocal minority of parents to impose their beliefs on all parents and students while doing nothing meaningfully to increase parental involvement in their children's education. That bill also included provisions requiring schools to out transgender students to their parents, even if this put children at the risk of physical harm. Now we are considering another piece of this extreme agenda, one that targets transgender kids. Sports are an invaluable part of the school experience. School sports activities offer fundamental life lessons such as leadership, self-confidence, and teamwork that every child should be able to enjoy. As members of Congress, our responsibility is to eliminate barriers students face in every facet of school life, including athletics. Our efforts should concentrate on ensuring that student athletics are, above all, fair and safe. H.R. 734 does the exact opposite. It makes school sports less fair by singling out and banning transgender women and girls, as young as kindergarten, from participating on school sports teams with their friends. We know transgender students already face widespread bullying and discrimination. Adding to their pain by targeting their participation in school sports is both wrong and dangerous. Trans girls participate in sports for the very same reasons as their friends: to be part of a team, to learn sportsmanship, and challenge themselves. We shouldn't be denying them those opportunities. Furthermore, contrary to my Republican colleagues' claims, H.R. 734 actually makes school sports less safe for women and girls. To enforce its ban on transgender student athletes, the bill could require all girls as young as in their preteens to prove their gender through invasive screenings by adults they may not even know. Imagine that your 12-year-old daughter wants to play soccer, but before you can sign her up, she has to sit for an interview with some stranger who will ask her questions about her body and potentially even have to submit to an exam. I would never want that for my former students or my constituents, and I'm sure members of this committee wouldn't want that either. Simply put, H.R. 734 does not protect women and girls. It only makes school sports less safe and less fair. Now, these are schools, states, there are schools and states and sports associations that have been allowing transgender people to play equitably and consistent with their gender identity with no issues for decades. At the most elite level, this bill does not address organizations like the International Olympic Committee, which have frameworks for gender inclusion, transgender inclusion in sports, and they reject the type of categorical ban Republicans are pushing for kids as young as kindergartners. Congress has no business targeting transgender women and girls and imposing a nationwide ban on their participation in school sports. It is completely inappropriate for politicians in Washington to risk our children's safety by subjecting them to needless physical examinations and invasive screenings. And as a member of the LGBTQI community myself, I'm tired. I'm tired of hearing lies spread about my community in hearings and on the floor. I'm tired of having to defend the very existence of members of my community. I'm tired of watching members of this body target trans kids for discrimination to score political points with a small slice of their base. We need to refocus our job in Congress to address the most pressing issues facing students and parents and ensure that every child in America can reach their full potential. So I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 734, and I look forward to answering questions of the members of this committee.
Thank you for your comments. In the interest of time, the chair will forego questions. Go to Dr. Burgess, distinguished ranking member of the committee, for any questions he might have.
I thank the chairman. Chairwoman Fox, let me just ask you a question, a basic question for people that are watching. What was the original purpose of Title IX?
The original purpose of Title IX was to make sure that girls and women were able to have the same opportunities in sports as men and boys had. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Title IX last year. And, you know, I can remember when Title IX came along, what a huge difference it made in the way young women in particular were able to participate in sports. They were not able to do that before. And I have some. Well, I did that too. I turned it on and it went off. I'm sorry. Sorry, it was on, then it went off. Okay.
You're not in charge.
I think my voice is pretty good. I know I have some statistics on this somewhere that I can get to you about how the numbers have increased since Title IX was put into effect. They're astronomical.
So let me just,
Elementary and secondary level as well as at the college level. And they've meant so much to students because before this, students were denied scholarships. That was not working. female students couldn't get scholarships and were really denied lots of opportunities. And so Title IX was meant to treat women and girls fairly along with boys when it came to sports and other activities.
So 50 years have gone by, or is that level of fairness still important today?
Oh, absolutely, still important today. They, again, the growth in the participation of women and girls in sports proves that. When we want to maintain that, we don't want to see biological males coming in, as I described before, and knocking women out of opportunities to become champions.
So let me just ask you a question about that. Do you have any ideas as a committee, as they've done their work on this, do they have any idea of the numbers of people who have been denied or displaced from scholarships because a male was participating in women's sports?
I'm not sure I have that at my fingertips, but I can get that for the record.
Okay, that would be great.
We can get that for the record.
So Mr. Liu apparently has that number.
The Women's Sports Foundation maintains that there have been no collegiate scholarships that have been denied to women as a result of a transgender woman competing in sports.
So the very famous case that the chairwoman referenced on the swim team,
Knocked her out of a national championship title.
uh,
Okay.
oh,
Whether or not it knocks them out of the scholarship or not, it seems to me is not, I mean, they will be knocked out of scholarships, I'm sure, if they haven't been already. But getting knocked out of being named as the national champion is pretty serious.
Pretty
it
serious.
seems to me.
Mr. Chairman, fascinating discussion. In the interest of time, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Distinguished ranking members recognized for questions.
Mr. Takano, do you want to respond to any of that?
Well, yeah, I would say that Title IX has made a tremendous difference, transformational difference in the lives of women and girls. Chairwoman Fox rightly cites statistics that show increased participation and opportunities for women and girls in sports. But I've been on the Education and Workforce Committee, or Education and Labor Committee, whatever you want to call it, for the last 10 years. And despite the progress made under Title IX, the Women's Sports Foundation estimates that men still have 1 million more opportunities than women in sports. So despite all that progress, the opportunities for women still pale in comparison to men participation. Not once have I seen the chairwoman or Republicans on the committee advance this concern in the form of a bill or in the form of legislation to make real substantive gains for women, whether it's the ability to practice in comparable facilities, whether it's the simple number of opportunities they have to get scholarships to go to participate in women's athletics at university. So, which leads me to the conclusion that the focus of this bill is not really about protecting girls and women. It is about focusing, imputing a stigma on a very vulnerable, small part of our population, which are trans people, trans women, and trans girls in particular. The governor of Utah vetoed similar legislation. He vetoed an outright comprehensive trans ban because when he cited out of the 75,000 young people who participate in sports in Utah, only 4 were trans, and only 1 of the 4 was a trans girl. And the governor just saw no reason why we should deny participation, because sports is not just about winning, it's also about participation. It's about connection to community. And why we would ostracize, why the legislature of Idaho they were a danger was absurd. This is the Republican governor, Idaho, who rejected a trans man, and I would urge the members of this committee to consider following suit with the governor of Utah and the governor of Indiana, who similarly rejected capital bans, which is what we still have.
Dr. Fox, how many trans girls do you think would be denied the ability to play sports as a result of this bill?
Well, let's just get to the nub of this, Mr. McGovern.
If you could answer my question first.
I don't know what a trans girl is. I know what a biological male is and a biological female is. So what we're talking about, and I'm going to read the two paragraphs that are this bill. It shall be a violation of subsection A for a recipient of federal financial assistance who operates, sponsors, or facilitates athletic programs or activities to permit a person whose sex is male to participate in an athletic program or activity that is designated for women or girls. For the purpose of this subsection, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. What we're saying in this bill is that if you were born a male, then you cannot participate in, you cannot compete against people born as female. It's very simple. And I'd like to, Mr. Chairman, put into the record an article called, entitled, "A Biologist Explains Why Sex is Binary" by Colin Wright, Wall Street Journal, April 9, 2023. I'd
Without
like to
objection.
submit that. Thank you very much. This is very simple again. We're talking about people born as males not participating against people born as females. It's so simple. And it has nothing to do, not one word in here talks about targeting trans people, giving physical examinations. None of the things that our colleagues have said here. This is ridiculous what you are saying.
No,
that
excuse
this
me,
bill
I
would
reclaim my
do.
time. What is ridiculous is that we're spending time with all the problems that we're faced, including a spike in gun violence against children. What is ridiculous is that we are here debating this.
No,
I mean,
we're here to protect women.
You can't even define, you say you don't even know what a trans woman or a trans girl is, but yet you want to ban them from playing in sport.
No. The word trans is nowhere in this bill. It says.
We all know what this bill's about. We all
permit-
know what this bill is about.
No, this bill says if you're a biological male, you cannot participate against biological females. It's as simple as that.
And so
That
you-
is
and
that
so-
is what it
and
boils
so
down
you
to.
do not believe that that trans women are women?
They're males, sorry. If they were born as males, they're males. There's no way to change your biological sex.
So we just learned that we can't identify a single case where somebody was denied a scholarship because of what is happening right now, and yet there's this urgency to bring this legislation to the floor to somehow protect people. I don't quite get it, Mr. DeCano. Can you explain what the urgency about this is, and why, I mean, and it was this the first bill that was marked up in the Education Committee?
It's one of two first markup bills.
Of all the issues out there,
Yeah.
in terms of issues protecting kids in school, this is like the top one or two issues that the Education Education Committee thinks
Well,
is vital to bring to the floor?
And Mr. McGovern, the moral panic that the chairwoman is attempting to create over this case of the athlete competing in intercollegiate sports, winning a competition, this bill would do nothing to affect that. This bill is about banning sports participation of transgender girls and women in K-12 and college sports, but it would not effectively deal with whether or not in elite competition there's this question over trans women participating. This bill has nothing to do with that. This bill would not remedy the concern that the chairwoman raised. And let me also say that the real harm here is the exclusion from participation of trans young people, trans kids, trans middle school kids, trans high school kids, for whom the huge value of sports is about participation. It's about connection to community. And this bill would stigmatize them. This bill would separate them out. This bill would subject them to even more isolation than the bullying that they often face and the physical dangers. Trans kids are in need of our protection, not of stigmatization. And despite these words not being in the text of the bill, the effect of this bill would be exactly that. Let me just sort of read one of the final paragraphs from the governor of Utah, his veto message. The governor of Utah, as he vetoed a very similar bill, and he wrote it to so Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah, wrote to Stuart Adams, who was the president of the Senate, and Brad Wilson, the Speaker of the House of Utah. He said, there's one more important reason for this veto, I must admit. He says, I'm not an expert on, I quote, on transgenderism. I struggle to understand much of it, and the science is conflicting. When in doubt, however, I try to err on the side of kindness, mercy, and compassion. I also try to get proximate, and I'm learning so much from our transgender community. There are great kids who face enormous struggles, and here are the numbers that have most impacted my decision. 75,000, 4, 1, 86, and 56. 75,000 high school kids participating in high school sports in Utah. 4 transgender kids playing high school sports in Utah. 1 transgender student playing girls' sports. 86% of trans youth reporting suicidality. The chairwoman claims, this is not the governor's words, but I just want to insert, claims that she doesn't know anything about trans. 56% of trans youth having attempted suicide. 4 kids and only 1 of them playing girls' sports. That's what this is all about? 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships? 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they're part of something? 4 kids trying to get through each day. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they are going through or why they feel the way they do, but I want them to live. And all the research shows that even a little acceptance and connection can reduce suicidality significantly. For that reason, as much as any other, I have taken this action in the hope that we can continue to work together to find a better way. If a veto override occurs, I hope we can work to find ways to show that these 4 kids that we love them and that they have a place in our state. I was getting moved just reading that statement from the Republican governor of Utah. My respect and admiration for him just grew enormously just having those words registered. I would implore the members of this committee to heed his words seriously.
Well, I thank you for that, and I too, I think those were very moving words by the Republican governor of Utah, who's not playing to the cheap seats, who's actually putting the well-being of the people he represents first and foremost. I mean, the bottom line is this bill is not about protecting kids or children or anything. This is a bill that is an attempt to try to drive another wedge in our society, to try to create an issue where there isn't one, and in doing so, will directly impact in a very negative way a vulnerable community in this country that are already the subject of bullying and ostracization, and I may go right down and you're going to see more young people turn to suicide, more young people go down the road of depression and feel like that they're not worth anything, that we're questioning their dignity. As I said in the beginning, I think this is just an awful, rotten thing to do. This is, and my friends on the other side, the creepy obsession with these issues is really, I think, beneath what we should be doing at this point. Want to protect children? I mean, kids are getting murdered every day in gun violence, and here we are talking about this. I mean, you know, I don't. There's a disconnect here. Maybe this polls well amongst the small, you know, amongst the MAGA base or whatever, or maybe you can find ways to raise money off this. But this is not responsible legislating. This is a terrible thing to do at this point. And so you know, let's get on with this. And again, let's get it over with, and hopefully the Senate doesn't take it up. And I trust the president would veto it if it ever reached his desk. But we should be about bringing people together, about promoting understanding and respect for everybody, for promoting the idea that everybody is worth something, everybody has dignity. And here we are dealing with this, which will promote bigotry and hate, and quite frankly, I think will result in more young people taking their lives. And I think that's a terrible, terrible thing. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to refocus what the bill is about. Chairwoman Fox was kind enough to read us the entire bill, and maybe, Chairwoman, you could explain how the Biden administration's interpretation of Title IX runs contrary to the original intent of the law. And so we focus back on the law and what we're talking about.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman Fishback. If you give me just 1 second to deviate,
Yep.
then I'll come back to your
Yes,
question.
absolutely.
I found the statistics. Title IX, since its enactment, female participation in sports has increased 1,057% at the high school level and 614% at the post-secondary level. Go back to Dr. Burgess's question a moment. But to come back to your question, you know, it's very interesting to me that the biggest proponents of Title IX, when Title IX was put into place, and since it was put into place until very recently, were Democrats. Republicans supported it, I believe, but it was really, really pushed by Democrats. And yet here we are with a Democrat administration and Democrats in this body who are saying that it's not okay for women to be treated as equals. And so what the Biden administration has said is that no state can have a similar law. They are saying that states cannot do this. They are saying that the secretary might be able to make some exceptions to some rules and regulations that states want to put into place. I can't cite chapter and verse of the rule, but I'm summarizing it. But basically it says a state can't do what it is we have written into this bill, which is to define biological males and define biological females, or say biological males cannot compete against biological females. So the rule that they have proposed, which has not yet gone into effect, would negate any kind of legislation like this at the state level.
Well,
And yet many states have already passed legislation like that.
Title IX seeks to create equal opportunity in the education
Correct.
system on the basis of sex, and yet allowing biological male participating in these activities runs directly contrary to that goal.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it creates an unlevel playing field where women are at a disadvantage in activities that were designed for them. And you agree with that. And I don't think we need to look very much further than the swimming results that you mentioned in your statements. But it is sad to hear about the women who are being forced into uncomfortable situations in the locker rooms, and having their hard work and their lifelong work and goals, mean nothing. Yes, this is important. This is important to those people being affected, those women being affected by by the policies that are now taking over. And I do think we should show compassion to the females that are being hurt by this.
Absolutely. Our whole idea here in Congress is to prevent discrimination. And that's what Title IX was all about, because women and girls were being discriminated against. And that's what we're trying to see enforced, is fairness for women and girls, and to prevent discrimination.
And Madam Chair, I absolutely want to see that fairness and that restored to these individuals. You know, my heart goes out to the young lady, the swimmer, who was not only lost the title, but in addition to that was attacked at one of her speaking engagements. And so I appreciate the bill, and I look forward to supporting it on the floor. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. You know, we all did spend those 2 weeks at home. I spent a little longer because of my surgery, but I was still in contact with so many teachers and students and parents across my vast district. And we know that children in New Mexico and across this nation face so many unique and heartbreaking challenges. So when we walk through these amazing halls that we get to work in with the responsibility we have to keep all of our constituents safe, I am looking for those solutions to the problems we actually face. Chairwoman Fox, what is the leading cause of death for children under 18 in the United States?
Well, I've heard it said here today that it is gun violence.
Yes, indeed. Gun violence is the greatest cause of death for children under 18. More children die of gun violence than any other cause. And that to me is among the most urgent issues when it comes to making sure our kids are safe and cared for in our schools. Indeed, you know, since Columbine, 349,000 children have suffered through gun violence in the schools, because it's not just the ones who die, it's not just the ones that have been shot and are recovering in a hospital, it's all of those who had to suffer through. If you have not read the stories of the young boy who played he was dead in Uvalde, if you have not heard those stories and recognized that something needs to be done, Chairwoman Fox, I think the one too many, you pointed out that one too many is too much. To me, 349,000 are too many. There were 46 school shootings last year, and those numbers are only rising. Chairwoman Fox, does this bill do anything to address the scourge of gun violence in our schools?
The intent of this bill has nothing to do with gun violence.
Thank you.
It's all about
Thank you.
treating women fairly.
Thank you. I would indeed say that last year, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That law helps provide resources to fight the mental health crisis amongst our youth. It was pointed to in several of my visits to the schools because it was going to attack a major issue facing our children. That law is an example of how Democrats and Republicans can work together with President Biden to actually help our kids. I really want to thank our Chairman Cole for having supported that bipartisan law. Representative Takano, thank you so much, Chairman Takano, for reading that passage of the governor. The idea that his goal, not understanding, in some ways maybe similar to Chairwoman Fox, as to what is really about with a transgender child. That was so moving, the fact that that governor just wanted to make sure that the children in his state stayed alive. Can you talk a little bit more about the impact that a law like this and other laws that are targeted, that are using trans children and trans people as targets in order to get people mad, in order to get people to pay money, to send in money to political campaigns? Tell us a little bit about what happens to the actual children when they see this kind of attack on who they are.
Well, there is, I think, obviously not among all Republicans, because the governor of Idaho is a Republican, the governor of Indiana is a Republican. So not all Republicans are engaging in extreme efforts, extremist efforts to target trans kids, to up in public education. But there has been political success in some parts of our country where some other governors, notably Governor DeSantis of Florida, has seen a political advantage in using and riding the wave of misunderstanding, of creating more fear among parents. Parents care a lot about their kids. We all know parents care about their kids. And it's not too hard with a person who sits in a place of leadership to manipulate those fears, to fan those fears, to the detriment of a very, very vulnerable population that's not understood. And even my colleague, the chairwoman, claims not to even grant that trans people and trans young people exist. Simply don't exist. And therefore, it makes it easy for them to write a piece of legislation and have it purport to be about protecting girls and women. This bill does not protect girls and women. It does not increase opportunities for women to compete at the collegiate level or to win more scholarships, for women and girls to have equal playing fields, to have access to facilities and practice fields that are on par with what men have and what boys have, to have the same, to have parity in the kinds of sports teams, to have a girls and a sports team, girls and boys sports team. This bill does nothing to ameliorate the fact that, according to the Women's Sports Foundation, men and boys still have 1 million more opportunities than girls do. And I haven't seen the chairwoman or any Republican advance such legislation. Why are they saying that this bill achieves that purpose when its main purpose is to target a group of people that they don't even say exists? So that's an issue. So sports bans don't just negatively impact transgender and intersex athletes being targeted, but also the mental health of transgender and other LGBTQI youth more broadly. 85% of transgender and non-binary youth say that recent debates around anti-trans bills have negatively impacted their mental health. And Congresswoman, let me just say, I remember being a teenager in California when a state senator named John Briggs qualified for the ballot an initiative known as the Briggs Initiative, which would have banned gay teachers or LGBT teachers from teaching in the schools. That debate affected me as somebody growing up, as someone being a teenager. And so I can completely understand how just this debate about transgender youth and sports, transgender book banning, banning books that even mention them. I mean, this movement, this extremist movement, doesn't even want kids to have access to books that tell them, that reveal their experience, the experience of who they are. It's not about converting them. It's not about making more trans kids or grooming them. It's about just having kids know that there's somebody who understands their experience. This debate, the kind of divisive debate we're having, is affecting the mental health of transgender kids and other LGBTQI youth.
Thank you very much. And, I've read reports that show that 29% of transgender youth have actually been threatened or injured with a weapon or on school property, compared to, 7%. Any bullying is wrong. But to see that multifold increase on transgender kids is really scary. And this kind of bill just gives more to that, especially if you have some of the intrusive needs to verify somebody's gender, right? And that's what you were talking about that we need to be worried about. one of the things that I think is very concerning, I don't know if you did read the recent article that came out in the New York Times of how a campaign against transgender rights mobilized conservatives. And that article, actually, they poll tested what would get people the most upset as some of the issues around equality seem to fade. Because now I think there is a general acceptance among many that you can get married, that we can have LGBTQ marriage equality, right? So that I think is, did you read that article?
I actually did read that article, and one of the things the article, one of the ideas that it put forward was the idea that the American people have generally moved on about gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. That there's been a greater acceptance, and that the so-called culture war over lesbian, gays, and bisexual people has generally been lost by the conservative right. I would say I know a lot of conservatives who embrace LGBT. I mean, it's not a liberal or conservative thing, but there is an extremist element of our country that is looking to capitalize politically, to gain power, based on America's, I think, less familiarity, the Americans' relatively less familiarization of trans people. I think over time, Americans are going to come to understand transgenderism, and they're people who have put forward bills like this either will be ashamed or history will look very unkindly on this very ugly episode in our history.
Right, same as LGBTQ. These are children who are children. There are children, there are our cousins, there are brothers. They are part of who we are. We cannot deny them as they are. We cannot deny their existence and their ability to be able to play sports, to be able to, I mean, I read one of the articles in fact, I think I was involved in the Supreme Court case, in the case where it's like, that child was actually very bad at sports, but it was somewhere where she was able to participate with her friends and participate in those school activities. Chairman Cole, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the April 16, 2023 New York Times article, How a Campaign Against Transgender Rights Mobilized Conservatives.
Without objection.
And I think the other point that you were making, Representative Takano, was with regards to who is mad about this. And that I have looked at the writings and the statements of women's organizations, women in sports organizations. There is a long list of women who are in sports who oppose this law. Chairman Cole, I would like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record statement of women's rights and gender justice organizations in support of full and equal access to participation in athletics for transgender people.
Without objection.
So can you speak a little bit more on where the position is of women in sports on this issue?
Well, there are notable sports figures who have taken, I think, a position of fear. And there are a great many more women, accomplished sports figures, who are very supportive of transgender women and girls participating in sports. It should be pointed out at the elite level, at the Olympic level and intercollegiate sports level, transgender women have been welcomed into competition. This bill, the proponents of this bill, are seeking to use one very notable instance of controversy to ban participation of all trans students across the country. And the ironic thing, the moral panic, the panic of unfairness that's been created by that one instance at the intercollegiate level in swimming, this bill would do nothing to address. This bill would use the federal leverage of denial of funding to insist that schools ban all transgender students from participating. That is the egregious thing of this bill.
Thank you. And Chairwoman Fox, thank you very much for your support of Title IX. I think I kind of missed Title IX. It didn't make it to my little town in northern New Mexico. They took a while to get on, so I didn't, it wasn't until I could play softball here with the Congressional Women's Softball Club that I was able to pick up a bat and catch a ball. But we heard about the fact that there are such inequities. Representative Takano went through them. Does this bill actually address any of those inequities, like resource facility, equipment inequities, budget cuts, any of those? Does this bill do anything about that?
As I mentioned earlier, Title IX has been in existence for 50 years as of last year, and so my belief is that where there were dramatic inequities, that those have been taken care of. Otherwise, people would have been filing lawsuits under Title IX and seeking redress. I just want to say this bill doesn't deny anyone an opportunity to participate in sports. In fact, it protects the equal opportunity of girls and women to participate in athletics. So this supports Title IX.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
This supports Title IX.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I think there is still, and part of what has been entered into the record talks about the inequities. So Title IX isn't quite perfect yet, and yes, there have been efforts to increase it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are a couple of things that I want to correct here that I've heard said already. First, I want to give Chairwoman Fox a chance to respond to something that Mr. Takano said, but I want to give Mr. Takano a chance to say it again. You claimed, I believe, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll let you say what you said, that Chairwoman Fox believes that biological men who identify as women don't exist. Is that correct, that she's denying their existence?
She has stated that she doesn't know what trans is.
But you said...
and she doesn't want to address the rights of trans girls and women or trans people in general, and we can get further into
No, I'm not
the weeds,
asking about the rights. It's not the rights that you called into question, I believe. You said that she said these people don't exist. You said that. We can go back.
She said, what I heard her say is, I don't know anything about trans people. I don't know what that means.
No, but let me, and we could, I'll apologize later if I'm mischaracterizing what you said, but you used the word exist. You said that she says they don't exist. I believe she's not calling into question their existence. She's calling into question this fantasy that they could change their sex.
Correct.
Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're exactly right. I do not deny the existence of people who say they are biologically one sex but identify as another. Certainly there are people in this country who say that. My point was, one cannot change one's biological sex. It has not been found to be possible. I used to teach sociology. Back in the 70s and 80s, one of the books that I put on the list for my students to read was a book called Conundrum. It was actually about a male who had grown up as a male who later in life decided he was going to identify as a female. So I've been familiar with this phenomenon since way before many other people were familiar with them. I add that book as one of the books my students could read in a marriage and the family class because I thought it was an issue that would be good for them to understand. or to be familiar with. I'll go back to what I said to begin with, Mr. Massey, and thank you for asking the question. I do not believe it is possible for a person to change one's biological sex.
Let me
And
ask,
so when I said I don't understand what you mean by transgender, what I mean is, how does one go from one gender to another? You might change the way you behave, but you cannot change your biological sex.
Mr. Takano, are there biological differences between men and women that are immutable, unchangeable?
Well, there are biological sex characteristics, and we also know that there are intersex individuals whose biological characteristics are ambiguous, and who were assigned a particular sex by a medical practitioner, and some of these individuals have grown up experiencing themselves contrary to the assigned sex that was given by the medical professional when they were born. So we know that exists, and we also know
Those
that there are-
cases
can I-
do exist, but I think
well,
it
and there are also-
obfuscates the
Well, can I-
discussion
can
we're
I-
having here
no,
now.
I don't think
So
it-
let me re-ask the question.
Well, let me-
Because I think you agree with Ms. Fox. You said that there are biological characteristics that are different between men and women that are immutable.
Well, there's also the aspect.
Do you agree with that?
Wait a minute, Mr. Massey.
Okay.
Mr.
you
Mr.
take
Massey, let me-
half an
let me-
hour,
let me-
and then I'll ask the question again.
Let me finish. There are also cases where people are born with the sex characteristics are male or female, but whose interiority, whose experience is contrary to that. And that's not necessarily something, the chairwoman implied that was a choice. That is also of an entire biological system, something that presents itself. So that I wouldn't say that sums up everything, but I would say in a very simple way, there are people who are born with the sexual characteristics of one sex, but who then experience themselves as the opposite, as the contrary.
Do you agree that,
And that's not a matter of choice.
I'll let you filibuster.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Do you agree that there are biological differences that are immutable between men and women?
There are biological differences.
Like their chromosomes, for instance?
There are biological differences.
Okay. So maybe it's a matter of degree, but to some degree, you agree with Representative Fox, Chairwoman Fox, that you can't change your biological sex. You could change your appearance, but you can't change your biological
I think
sex.
I'm not transgender, so I can't, but if I were to speak for them, I would say that a transgender person, might say that it's not about them changing their sex, it's about being who they are.
But the bill speaks just of their sex, their biological sex, not how they identify.
We're talking about the totality of a person.
Why do
And
they?
as the governor of Utah said, he struggles to understand it, but in that struggle, he would err on the side of compassion and understanding.
Chairwoman Fox doesn't seem to struggle much with this. Why do we have two different categories of sports leagues? Why do we even separate them by male and female?
Well, in California and many other states, not just California, so it's not just a California thing, but wrestling, for example, is not divided among, there's not a girls' team or a boys' team. Girls will compete according to weight class, and I've seen girls compete in wrestling tournaments against boys. This is not about, so this law is about the inclusion of trans girls and trans women, but
Wouldn't that
in this
solve it
case,
all? Just get rid of the different leagues?
well, Mr. Massey, this is an interesting question. I wish that we would have had a hearing to explore all these different kinds of situations. But this bill would categorically ban trans girls and trans women from sports, which is contrary to allowing states and localities figure out on a sport-by-sport, case-by-case basis is what the NCAA and the Olympic Committee have admitted women and women athletes for many, many years now. They have metrics, scientific metrics they use to sort of evaluate the fairness of competition. This is something, I'm saying this is, you know, you of all people should.
Let me ask you that. Let me ask you that, because you did touch on something. There's a libertarian case to be made that the Department of Education shouldn't exist, and that Title IX shouldn't exist, and it should all be left up to the states and localities. Are you making that argument against this bill? Are you saying that the federal government should not be involved?
Well, I think very, very good, Mr. Massey.
Because you could compel me with that argument.
Very, very, very interesting. But Title IX is not gender specific. It just says there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex. And I celebrate the fact that Chairwoman Fox has noted the tremendous progress that women and girls have made in terms of sports participation. But we're nowhere near a level of parity of women and girls. And what I have not seen, I as a Democrat and would have preferred to have seen legislation which addressed the disparity rather than crafting or amending Title IX to specifically circumscribe girls and women, trans girls and women.
Let me ask where we started before we went down this path. Why do we have two different categories? Why was a separate category created for women?
There was no separate category.
In leagues. No, I mean in sports. For instance, I have a relative who's female who got a tennis scholarship. She went to a college where it was dominated by the football team.
Yes.
And there were many males there. Why did they create categories of sports or leagues that are female exclusively? Why do they exist?
Well, they exist for giving women opportunities to.
Can't they have those opportunities in the male leagues?
They often do on a sport-by-sport basis. I cited wrestling as an example.
So
if a girl, there's not a girls' tackle football team.
Why not?
The expense of it. I'm glad you asked the question. That should be a question we deal with.
Shouldn't we just tell them all just play football with the guys?
I think we should have a hearing. They do. In California, if you want to compete, if a girl wants to compete on the boys' football team, because of Title IX, they have a right to, because there's not a girls' tackle football team. But this should be explored in a committee. We should have a hearing on this exact topic.
I think many years ago, the answer to girls who wanted to play sports was suit up and get in there and mix it up with the males. And what we found out is that doesn't really work out well for the females. In a lot of sports, there are sports where females may excel a bit more so than males, but not in a lot of these.
Well, Ms. Massey,
so if you're making the case, and I'll let you speak here in a second, but it almost sounds like that's where we're going with this, and it's troubling to me and a lot of females. Let me get to the other thing that I think was mischaracterized here. I wasn't going to bring up the politics today, but the other side brought up the politics of this and claimed that this riles up the right-wing base, that somehow there's an electoral advantage to be had by playing to the right-wing base here. The reality is the people who are most concerned about this are moms, are women who are more moderate or maybe not even politically affiliated because they don't want their daughters being denied opportunities. They don't want their daughters in the same restrooms as the boys. And so it's not about, like, the politics of this is not about riling up the base. In fact, if you go look at the demographics, it was mentioned and I wouldn't have brought up this name, but it was already brought up, so I'll bring it up. Governor Ron DeSantis won in a landslide in Florida on this issue, not by riling up the base, but because more so than ever, you had Democrats who voted for him and independents who voted for him, more so than in other races, typically in Florida. He did not get a 20-point victory by riling up the base over wokeism. He got a 20-point victory by expressing common sense attitudes that moderates and independents hold.
And my understanding is that he won in 2016 because of Black mothers who believe in school choice. And he won by about 40,000
Massey, if I
votes
could-
because those parents want school choice. And so I think you make an excellent point. And if you hear over and over again, Mr. Massey, the word extremist, 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 that's all the other side can talk about. Extremist efforts to target trans kids. And I read the bill, and there's nothing in this bill to target trans kids or to ban books.
Mr.
There's
Massey,
nothing in here.
If I could,
for that.
if I could address.
Let me ask you.
If I could address the
I'm going to
extremists.
move on because
Okay.
everybody
Okay.
wanted to be done by 7, and I'm already, I think, inspiring the ire of my colleagues who want to get done soon, but or in time just to do other things, like vote. Do you believe that biological men should be able to compete for scholarships, women's scholarships, if they so much as identify as a woman?
Well, I think trans women, we should start from the premise of inclusivity, because you're avoiding the use of trans women. You want to put forward your terms and proceed on a debate, but I will say that there are trans women. I do think that the International Olympic Committee and the NCAA have accepted trans women on a sport-by-sport, case-by-case basis, okay? That's existed for many years, and we've only had a handful of cases where this issue of fair or unfair competition has become an issue.
If I
So it's
phrase
not-
the,
so it's-
okay,
so
let
it's
me
not-
let me
so it's not- so it's not been-
respond.
it's not been
If
an
I
issue.
phrase the question using your vernacular,
Yeah.
should trans women be able to compete for women's scholarships?
As a general rule, the answer is yes, but I think there ought to be accommodations.
Let me ask
There
another
ought to-
question.
Well, there ought to be,
Which, yep, let me ask you a few more questions.
there
and
ought
then
to
the
be
other side-
accommodations. There ought to be accommodations.
Mr. Chairman,
Well, I'm trying to be polite.
no, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to allow the witness to answer the question.
Well,
I mean,
gentlemen,
I get it, but out of courtesy,
Take a minute
out
or
of
two to
courtesy,
answer the question.
out of decorum and courtesy, I think it's appropriate to let him answer the
gentleman
question.
can
If you want to be
certainly-
rude, you don't have to.
gentlemen is certainly can raise the point. Opinion of the chair, I did not see any rudeness going on here, nor have I seen any lack of ability of people to participate in the discussion.
Well, we-
So
Be as
if-
generous as
if-
possible,
if-
so
Yeah, you have
Two-
been, sir, you have been.
If I may
appreciate-
finish?
I appreciate the give and take.
May I finish?
Sure.
Thank you very much. So just give yourself a little more time, but again, I did not detect an acrimonious exchange or anybody being rude to anybody in this exchange. So with that, I'll return the time to the gentleman.
And I yield to Mr. Takano.
Well, so we don't have a single example of a trans woman getting a scholarship in the first place, all right? But you're raising a hypothetical. Would I? We should really focus on increasing scholarship opportunities for all women. As I said, the issue is 1 million more opportunities for men than women right now. So the real issue is how do we increase opportunities for all women? So far, this hypothetical you've mentioned has not presented itself in reality of a transgender or a trans woman winning an athletic scholarship. We've not seen that happen. And in the
But
arena,
you wouldn't be against it.
on a case-by-case basis, we have to, I think, evaluate the situation in the way that the NCAA and the IOC do now.
I mean, is anything more required of a trans woman than to say she's a trans woman?
Well, I think
Are you putting conditions like you got to be a real trans woman to get a woman's scholarship? Or I mean, I want to give you a chance to say, what's the line?
Again, this is something that I think we should have done in a more robust committee hearing with trans people present, with trans experts, with the experience of athletic directors, the International Olympic Committee folks, the NCAA. We could have had a far more robust discussion than coming to this place, and where we arrived at is a complete and total ban, which is what 2 Republican governors have rejected after careful consideration. That's my concern. And you, as a libertarian with a deep suspicion of government overreach and government powers, this is a bill that ought to be antithetical to, I think, your beliefs.
Well, if you want to co-sponsor my bill to eliminate the Department of Education, feel free to join me. I'll yield. There are more questions, and I love the dialogue, but I'm going to yield back to the chair.
I appreciate the respect, the mutual respect we have for one another. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions.
Thank you so much. I find myself in a position of agreeing with Mr. Massey, rare though it may be, that we do need to consider the moms and the dads who are concerned that their daughters will be denied the opportunity to participate in sports, just as we need to consider the concerns of the parents of trans girls and women who want their daughters to be able to participate in sports. Look, I represent a region, Philadelphia, that is more than a little sports mad, and we have the props to deal with it, of course, with Super Bowls and all that. But I also come from a family that values participation in sports. My husband, my daughter, and I have all participated in organizations that provide sports-based youth development, not to create the next Olympian or the next NCAA star, but so that kids can get the opportunity to develop skills like teamwork and resilience and grit. And the law firm that I used to work at represented the U.S. women's soccer team, the U.S. women's ice hockey team in their quests for equitable treatment and pay, as well as representing other amateur athletes who'd been subject to discrimination or harassment of various sorts. So I am all in on the benefits of sports for our young people, and I think that should be provided as widely as possible. I find it really perverse that we're talking about the great benefits that have been provided by Title IX when that was all about expanding access to participation in sports, and this bill is going to deny access to participation in sports. So I just can't get behind this bill. I think it is a grotesque overreach, particularly in the competitive field when we already have the IOC and the NCAA and these other places that are dealing with the issues in competitive sports, just as we do, say, with wrestling or boxing. We have weight classes. I mean, there's all kinds of distinctions in sports that can be worked out when it's needed. So I do think this is an unnecessary injection. I find the constant specter that we've heard raised over the last couple of years here, the idea that somehow, you know, some strapping young man is going to put on a skirt so he can get a scholarship, that really is just beyond belief. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Mr. Takano?
Yeah, I'll just respond. Mr. Massey, I mean, you did focus on on the issue about what my referral to stoking up the base, and I note your observation that suburban moms were concerned about the opportunity that their girls would have. And that's a very real concern. I don't want to belittle that. But I'm also saying, what I also want to say in response to that is that it's the misunderstanding, this notion that a strapping male, so-called male athlete with all these physical advantages is going to put on a skirt or claim transgender identity in order to win at sports. I mean, it is a ridiculous notion that people are going to clamor to claim a different gender identity for this purpose, given how much transgender people, how much discrimination they face, how much harassment and bullying, and yes, they are often the focus of death. They are among the most vulnerable minority in our country, and for somebody to be claiming a different gender identity in order to become a collegiate athlete or win at that is a rather, I just think that is a very, very minute possibility. Is it possible? Yes, but highly, highly unlikely that people are going to step forward to do that. And so I think as we kind of knock down these misconceptions about trans people, I think its saliency among very concerned mothers is going to diminish and fall away. And again, people will look back at this moment of fear and false moral panic being created as a very ugly time. And people will be ashamed that they were taken in by these very fear-mongering arguments and ideations.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Roy's got to be at another meeting. Could you skip over me and go with him?
I certainly will. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the gentleman from South Carolina. And just a few questions. I'd associate myself with the line of questioning by my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey. But just, a couple of observations. The idea that this isn't having a dramatic and real impact on girls and women in sports right now is just ignoring truth. You've got a young lady in Connecticut who was the fastest girl in Connecticut, and then male transgender athletes were allowed to compete and beat her. This girl saying, I lost 4 women's state championship titles, 2 all New England awards, and numerous other spots on the podium to male runners. Now, I'm not there doing a test to the relative level of maleness of whoever it was running against this young lady, but it's a thing. This is happening. Riley Gaines didn't just make it up. We actually have eyes. We can actually look at the screen and see Leah Thomas and go, well, that was a guy. And then that guy's swimming against Riley Gaines. Riley Gaines competed her whole life, and now Riley Gaines didn't get a chance to win the trophy. That happened. We know it happened. We saw it happen. Anybody watching ESPN and all of their doting over the awesomeness of all of this knows that it happened. We saw it, in fact. It's not made up. It's not manufactured. It's not manufactured when you've got a significant difference between men and women, not just in stature or height or whatever, but things like often having average larger hearts, larger lungs, 12% higher concentration of hemoglobin, which helps transport oxygen to the blood, higher levels of testosterone, typically greater muscle mass on average. These things are just general biological average facts. And so then you get questions. Should the female athletes get to dope in order to compete against the formerly male, sort of still male, now male transgender athlete? Should the female athlete then get to dope and alter her hemoglobin? This is not manufactured. These are real issues. And you have a real situation where you've got parents concerned not just about that, which was the whole purpose of Title IX, to the various questioning of my friend from Kentucky, and into which we had an actual robust debate here about whether or not maybe Title IX should be brought into question in light of the current situation. But there's also the question of parents. This dad writing here, my daughter is forced to play and shower with 4 boys on her high school sports team. She is silenced. I, the father, said, I will not be. There are other examples of parents who have engaged to say, wait a second, should my daughter, I have a 12-year-old daughter, should my daughter be forced to change in a bathroom with a biological male? In whatever degree of trans that individual is. I wonder what the chairwoman thinks about that.
Well, I would wonder what Mr. Takano would think about that. I don't think that should happen, but I don't know what Mr. Takano thinks. Should biological girls be forced to go into showers with biological males?
Mr. Takano, I'd ask that question as well. Ranking member.
Well,
Takano.
regarding bathroom facilities, locker room facilities, I think these are, regarding the use of which facilities, that's a entirely different matter than what this bill is addressing. My objection to this bill, I want to bring it back to this bill, is a blanket prohibition on trans girls and trans women being able to participate in sports under the threat of the federal government withholding funding. And Mr. Roy, you brought up this example of an elite swimming competition. This bill would not solve the complexities around that issue. I want to remind you that the NCAA, which is the governing sort of the competitive governing body, has its own rules for when transgender people can participate in sports consistent with their gender identity. It has been doing this for decades, as well as the International Olympic Committee. They have accepted transgender athletic competitors, as I said, for decades. This is outside of the scope of government. So but that is being marshaled as an argument for why Title IX is now going to be refashioned through this amendment to ban categorically the participation of transgender girls and boys in sports. That is the core of my objection. Transgender bathrooms and transgender locker rooms, that's another subject to be taken up, and it's kind of extraneous and really not germane to this debate.
So to clarify, you do believe that biological males should be able to use the bathrooms in which our young women are changing and using to participate in sports or otherwise? Well,
Being able to access facilities consistent with one's gender identity is critical to the well-being of transgender people. Being unable to go to the restroom or locker rooms consistent with your identity undermines your ability to perform normal daily activities. Arguments that providing transgender people access to facilities consistent with their gender identity will undermine women's safety. Making that argument is really not have any basis in reality. Laws like Title IX, which protect LGBTQI plus people from discrimination, do not authorize anyone to engage in abusive or harassing behavior. So Title IX does not provide a cloak for that kind of behavior. If someone commits an assault, there are criminal laws to punish them. If someone harasses another person, there are laws to punish them. Over 300 domestic violence and sexual assault organizations, including the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence, and the National Center for Victims of Crime, have signed onto a national consensus statement of anti-sexual assault and domestic violence organizations in support of full and equal access for the transgender community. And as these groups have noted, non-discrimination laws do not allow men to go into women's restrooms, period. The claim that allowing transgender people to use the facilities that match the gender they live every day allows men into women's bathrooms or women into men's bathrooms is based either on a flawed understanding of what it means to be transgender or a misrepresentation of the law. And as these groups have further noted, non-discrimination laws protecting transgender people have existed for a long time. And in some cases, these protections have been in place for decades. These laws have protected people from discrimination without creating harm. And none of these jurisdictions have seen a rise in sexual violence or public safety issues due to non-discrimination laws. Assaulting another person in a restroom or changing room remains against the law in every single state.
So yes. So yes.
A transgender person should be able to access facilities consistent with their gender identity.
If their identity. So if they're a biological male and they have the reproductive organs of a biological male, they should be able to use the facilities that a biological female
Let's be
competing
clear.
under Title IX and in female
Let's be clear
sports
that men cannot access women's restrooms or facilities. A transgender person should be able to access facilities of the gender that they identify with.
So the answer is yes. So just one last point on this. Going back to the Connecticut example, just in Connecticut in the past several years, there's 2 male athletes have taken more than 80 sports opportunities from girls. Chelsea Mitchell was the one I mentioned before, who ran for Canton High School, lost 4 state championships, 2 all New England awards. And her quote was this: "It tells me that I'm not good enough, that my body isn't good enough, and that no matter how hard I work, I'm unlikely to succeed because I'm a woman." So is that what we think is the proper result of allowing biological males to compete against biological females in competitive sports? That a female athlete is left unable to compete in that case?
Well, look, the actual experience of both the cisgender and transgender athletes in this case that you mentioned in Connecticut prove how disconnected the claims that transgender inclusion will eliminate women's sports and women athletic scholarships actually are from reality. Chelsea Mitchell, one of the cisgender plaintiffs in the Connecticut case, defeated Terry Miller, one of the transgender athletes, in a Connecticut state championship just 2 days after her lawsuit was filed. All 4 cisgender plaintiffs received scholarships to run track in college, and there are currently, and 3 are currently part of NCAA Division I track and field programs. The 2 transgender athletes were not offered any scholarships, and we don't know of any examples of cisgender women athletes losing scholarships to transgender women athletes. Scholarships are awarded on a variety of factors, including athletic potential, team fit, academic standards, and more, not performance in a single game or competition. And this is just another argument to pit women against each other. Leading justice and women's sports organizations, including the Women's Sports Foundation, the National Women's Law Center, support the inclusion of trans, intersex, and non-binary students in sports and oppose this bill. And rather than pitting women against each other, we should be working to expand opportunities for all girls and women, opportunities that are severely limited compared to opportunities available to boys and men. Mr. Roy, I've cited a statistic that the Women's Sports Foundation has said and declared that men and boys have 1 million more opportunities than girls and women.
Yeah.
That ought to be our focus.
Right.
I hope that you and I could get on, an effort to expand opportunities instead of a false panic over the fact that over what you claim are trans athletes displacing cisgendered athletes. It's simply not true.
So that was another, I think, 3-minute yes, where, that doesn't really do a whole hell of a lot for Chelsea, who was on the outside looking in for trophies. And I would just say these associations, I mean, whatever, the American like Pediatric Association for sticking, our little babies with COVID shots. So I'm not really all that wound up about what associations think. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, would you skip over me? Ashley's got a press conference.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. Dr. Fox and Representative Takano, thank you for coming to testify before us today. We appreciate your time. I'm a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, and we had a robust hearing on this bill. I'm glad we're discussing this important issue today. I'm going to start out by saying something I never thought I would have to say in the Rules Committee or anywhere in Congress for that matter, but here it is. Women and men are different. That's not meant to be controversial. It's not mean-spirited. It's not outlandish or anything other than a factual statement. But perhaps I can be a little more specific. Women and men are physically different. Biological males do have competitive advantages related to size, height, and muscle mass. Women and men have different physical characteristics, and that is okay. But this is why Title IX exists, to ensure that despite these differences, women and men have the same opportunities in competition and for scholarship. Here are just some statistics for us to consider. Specifically, in the context of athletics, one study coming from the Duke University School of Law's Center for Sports Law and Policy notes the various differences between male and female athletes leads to a 10 to 12% performance gap between the sexes in athletic competition. Dr. Fox, I'd like to ask a simple question. If women and men are different, as this study suggests, other studies in common sense also suggest, is it unfair to allow biological men to compete in women's sports? Yes. Of course it is. That was a quick answer. I've seen the real effects of this. My two daughters are swimmers. And if they had to compete against biological males, which they have not yet, they would be outperformed by their male counterparts. I've seen the real effect of this in one swimmer named Riley Gaines. We've talked about her a little bit tonight. I actually spoke with her Friday about her experiences competing against a biological male. She was candid in her response, but respectful. And I'd like to just read a little bit from her statement. She says, in her own words, "In addition to being forced to give up our awards, our titles, our opportunities, the NCAA forced female swimmers to share a locker room with Leah Thomas, a 6'4", 22-year-old male equipped with and exposing male genitalia. We were not asked for our consent, and we did not give our consent. Unfortunately, my experience is not unique, and that's why I ask you to please pass H.R. 734. The number of female athletes who've been denied opportunities, traumatized, or hurt by policies that claim to promote inclusion is growing at an alarming rate. This is simply unacceptable, and the integrity of women's sports is eroding." Mr. Chairman, I would like unanimous consent to add this to the record.
Without objection.
So a couple of things I'd like to point out. Female fighter in the MMA fought against transgender MMA fighter Fallon Fox. This took place in 2014. Fallon Fox beat her female opponent, Tamika Brent, so severely she suffered a broken skull. In addition, there have been studies to show that in soccer, for instance, women are more susceptible to concussions than their male counterparts. Forbes magazine did an article that quotes exactly why women seem more vulnerable to these injuries remains largely unknown. Several theories, some biological and others cultural. Biologically, sex differences in neck musculature seem to be the most common explanation. Young women have less developed neck muscles than their male counterparts, and strong necks in men means the head doesn't move quite as much when there's an impact. It would simply be dangerous to put men, biological men, in many of these women's sports. And then, in addition to that, it is just fundamentally unfair. Allowing biological males to compete against female athletes is not progress. It takes away opportunities for females in sports. It brings me to questions like, what about biological females on the team? What about other women on the team? Who will stand for them? And I'm proud of Riley Gaines for standing for those women, and I will stand with them too. I think the Democrats want us to believe that there is no difference, that it should just be, as we've heard today, that biological men should be in locker rooms with biological women. As a parent, I don't think it has to necessarily be either or. We've heard leaders in this industry talk about open classes. Why we're forcing this issue on our young women in an uncompetitive way makes absolutely no sense to me. This bill couldn't be more important to our young female athletes. I will stand with our young female athletes, our student athletes, to protect them. I'm proud to be a supporter of this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
I'm going to try again. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I too can't believe we're sitting here with all the problems this country faces brought on by this administration, with the issues with border crossings, and it's been brought up about the deaths of mentally ill, those who kill children that are mentally ill. Look at those who have killed crossing because they have an open border. Look at the rapes that are occurring. And here we are talking about, is a biological man, should he be allowed to compete with biological women? Mr. Takano, help me understand now, is your definition of a transgender that person who gets a sex change operation, or is it just about that person who identifies?
No, sir. Not all. I don't know the relative numbers of transgender individuals who get a gender confirmation surgery. No, that's not necessarily a definition of someone who's transgender who physically alters, their biological characteristics. I think maybe a simplest way to maybe describe what a transgender person is somebody who is born with biological characteristics of one gender, but experience themselves as being of another gender. And I don't believe that these folks see this as a matter of choice. It's something, I think, akin to what a gay person feels, or a lesbian, when they see that they have attractions to the same sex, right? So it's an interior, subjective experience that is not something that is completely chosen.
But as it relates to this, if you identify as a female, not having the sex change operations, but if you identify as a female, you ought to be able to, biological man ought to be able to play in a biological female's sport.
Well, the short answer is yes, somebody who is trans.
Okay, that's all.
Someone who is trans, but understand, Mr. Norman, the idea that people would do this in order to take advantage of biological advantages, I think is just not correct. It's not true. And if you were to see some trans girls participate in sports, I think for the most part you would see that they're girls, pretty much girls.
Should Mike Tyson, have you heard of him?
Yes, I have.
If he identifies as a female, should he be allowed to box?
Well, look, again.
No, that's a very simple question, because you said yes, that if he identifies, should he be allowed to enter a boxing match with a biological female?
Well, I think there's room for, as the NAACA and the IOC, they've accepted trans women as athletes for many years on a sport-by-sport, case-by-case basis. It's not an absolute. It's not an absolute inclusion.
But the answer is yes. If he identifies, he ought to be able to box.
I didn't say that.
Earlier you said if he had.
Well,
let me just ask you this. I thought earlier you said if you identify, that, yes, that qualifies
What it
you.
has, what it had to do with the question I think you're referring to is over facilities and
No.
bathrooms, about if
Participation.
they identify, if they want to participate. So if you want a trans girl, a trans woman, if that's what you identify as, I believe you should have the opportunity to participate in the sport that's consistent with your gender. You should be able, a trans girl needs to be able to
She
participate.
identifies as I'm asking, if she identifies as a female,
Yes.
if she
But if-
identifies as a male, she ought to be able to compete.
Yeah. Well, look, the example you brought up of Mike Tyson, that brings up this image of this extraordinary athlete, highly developed musculature, but the idea that males, trans women, that's who trans women are, or trans girls for that matter, are these human beings that are going to take advantage of their biological advantages. I think that's a misconception about participation.
Have you looked at pictures of Leah Thomas
I
as
have.
compared? Is he obviously a male or is he a female?
I have. Well, I want to just remind you that this bill is not about most
that.
elite competitions. It's about K-12 and college students. And what this bill does, it's a blanket ban over all participation of trans girls and women.
Okay, but-
So this issue of elite, we're arguing about, we're discussing elite competitions, and that, I'm telling you, is something that can be, is already being dealt with and doesn't need the government, does not, I mean, I respect you, Ms. Norman. You have a defined philosophy about limitation of government. And I'm telling you that what this bill does, it doesn't, one, solve the problem of elite competition and the potential unfairness that may ensue. But what it does do is it eliminates the opportunity for trans kids to connect and be part of a community.
But Mark, I think and Ms. Fox, I'll get right with you. I think what you're saying is, though, if take Mike Tyson, take any athlete, if he's male, biological male, that he can identify and then cross compete, which that's staggering that you're saying something like that.
Would
Because
the
roll the
gentleman-
clock back.
Well,
Would the
Ms. Norman, if I could just,
gentleman Quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
Would the gentleman yield for, are we talking about Mike Tyson, whether or not he identifies as a female, continuing to compete as a heavyweight? Because this is one of, there's a classification there, so he would be competing as a heavyweight boxer.
I'm saying if there's a women's boxing team that he qualifies for the weight, he can identify, as I think what Mark says, he can identify as a female and compete. But what is staggering is roll the clock back to a Mike Tyson when he was 12 years old. The stature hadn't changed. He was a biological man. But I think what Mr. Takano's saying is he can identify even when he was 12 and enter a female's bathroom, and which is staggering to me. I don't know if you've talked to Riley Gaines as I have. When you had Leah Thomas assaulting females, you could see his male genitalia. You could see that, and he was assaulting young women. She's on the record with that.
Assault is not something that I would permit. Assault is something that I would hope a prosecutor would prosecute. And if there's evidence that there was an assault, there should be a prosecution for that assault. That should not be permitted.
Does that facilitate assault? Letting a biological man go into a biological female's bathroom?
What I would say is a trans person, someone who is trans, who identifies, they should be able to use the facilities that they identify with. But I want to go back and address this notion of Mike Tyson. Here again, we're talking about elite competition, and that's its own discussion, which this bill doesn't solve or address. What it does do is it eliminates the ability of preteens, teens, to be able to participate in sports. I just remind you, Mr. Norman, in many states, wrestling competition is is not separated. They don't have many states, a girls wrestling team or a boys wrestling team. The girls just compete with the guys according to weight class.
It's like Mr. Massey said, I think you're in favor of just doing away with male, female, let everybody compete, have a free-for-all.
Well, that's not true. It's not true. I'm in favor of increasing the opportunities for women and girls generally, that there's 1 million more opportunities for men and boys than there are for women and girls. And that's the problem that we need to be focused on, not the minute number of trans kids that want to participate in sports. And we shouldn't be stigmatizing or isolating them out. And I know it's that you're a religious man and that you would believe that we would not want to ostracize or subject people to bullying or even higher rates of suicidality. That's just wrong.
Correct, I agree with you. Ms.
Yeah,
Fox?
thank you.
Well, I would just say that I've not heard the number that there are 1 million more opportunities for men than women or girls in sports. I don't understand why, for the past 4 years with the Democrats in the majority, they didn't do something about this. If this was such a big concern, or is such a big concern, they had an opportunity to do something about this. And not once have I heard this mentioned in the last 4 years. Not once. The other thing I'd mention, and I agree with Mr. Roy when he brought up his lack of respect for the associations. As far as I know, the NCAA and the IOC did nothing to help women advance in sports before Title IX. Not one thing did they ever do to lift a finger to help women and girls advance in sports. When Title IX was passed, then I think they got on board. But I think that bringing these things up about 1 million more opportunities for men, wow, if that exists, this is the first I've heard about it as a member of the committee. I'm surprised that there wasn't a hearing on this while the Democrats were in the majority, and they didn't say, well, we have to do more for Title IX. Suddenly, why aren't we doing more for women? It's just exactly, it seems to me, the opposite, is if biological males are allowed to compete with biological females, what's going to eventually happen, as somebody else mentioned, we're going backwards. We're going to erase women in sports because biological males will take advantage of this opportunity, I believe.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It happened with Riley Gaines.
Exactly, it did.
She won the race. It happened. And I don't know, evidently he identified as a female, and he won the race. You look at him, he's a biological male. End of story.
Well, I find it kind of interesting that for 3 years, he was a mediocre member of the team.
You know what he ranked when he competed against biological men? 464th. How do you do that? Then you go to number one when you compete with a biological female.
If it isn't being seen as an opportunity, then I don't know what it was in that particular situation.
Yeah, if that's not an opportunity that he took advantage of because of this insanity that's going on in this country with, trying to say that there's more than two sexes, there's a biological man and a biological woman. God made us that way. And let me ask you this, Ms. Fox. Over the centuries with the archaeological remains, did they ever mention that anything other than male and female, did they mention back then this remain was a transgender?
Not.
You weren't around then, I know that.
No, thank you for that. No, I think we've always known that there have been situations where there have been people who've identified differently than the majority of the people, very small numbers of people. But I don't know of anything that has been done that would unearth more than the two sexes.
Two sexes. And if
And
I had done it,
I believe that the article that, if you're interested in learning more about this, I think, and I think Mr. Massey talked about the genetics, the gametes, right? Gametes don't change. Yeah, you're either XX or XY.
Representative Norman, would you yield?
oh, yes, ma'am.
So there was actually a fascinating article that I read of a rabbi who went through the Old Testament and I identified the many different ways in which people were referred to, which included binary and many other things. I will find it and send it to you
Sure.
if you'd like.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I will
That was a
send it.
legitimate question. I don't want to belabor, we've exhausted this topic. But thank both of you for participating. And I will tell you, Mark, that there's opportunity for women now that have never existed, women, biological women. Look at and Ashley mentioned the MMA. MMA women are attracting a lot of followers.
Attention, yeah.
But now you put the Mike Tyson types into MMA, which he could easily go to. How fair would that be if you had a family member who did just what you said you agreed with, identify and go thrown in with that? I think that's unfair.
Well,
It's
Mr.
not
Norman-
safe and it's not unfair.
Mr. Norman, if I could just respond
Sure.
to that scenario. I think the MMA folks would have a lot to say about that, just as the NCAA and the IOC have something to say about that. Their stance is not an absolute inclusion, right? They have a concern about fairness of competition. And so that's a legitimate discussion. It's a legitimate debate to have. But what I'm telling you is that this bill is not about addressing that unfairness that you're pointing to. What this bill does is it basically eliminates the ability of trans girls and women to participate in K through 12 and collegiate sports participation on the team with which they identify gender-wise. And, I'm convinced if you and I explored this a lot longer, we would come to an understanding about this. And look, I think there's, what you cite is at the elite competition level, the professional level, let's allow those associations to figure that out.
Ms. Fox?
I just want to say again what the bill says. It shall be a violation of subsection A for a recipient of federal financial assistance who operates, sponsors, or facilitates athletic programs or activities to permit a person whose sex is male to participate in an athletic program or activity that is designated for women or girls. For the purpose of this subsection, sex shall be recognized based solely on a person's reproductive biology and genetics at birth. One cannot change one's biological sex. It is not possible. So I don't care what term you use, you have to participate with the people whose biology matches your biology.
Which the most outspoken person today is Riley Gaines. When she went into that dressing room and witnessed Leah Thomas, or whatever his name was when he was a male, supposedly, he had genitalia, and he was definitely a male. And he competed when he couldn't compete with males, biological males. And to go from 464th to 1 is unfair. It's unfair to Riley Gaines and others. It sets a tone that I think it does get to the bathroom issue. It does get to safety. It does get to protection, which children deserve that. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say, the idea of, and we're hearing this now in this debate, that people in locker rooms, about people in locker rooms, when this bill has nothing to do with that. It's a blanket ban on trans people from youth sports. And this is the same argument used against the LGBTQ community in the past. It relies on the same stereotypes and tropes against the LGBTQ people that were used by people trying to stop gay rights and gay marriage.
So the
It
gentleman,
didn't work then, but I would like to ask
Gentleman-
unanimous consent to insert in the record an article entitled Transgender People Over 4 Times More Likely Than Cisgender People to Be Victims of Violent Crime.
without objection, so ordered. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I know we're really up against the clock here. I wholeheartedly support H.R. 734 because it represents common sense. We're here, considering a bill that is exactly what the title says. It is the protection of women and girls in sports. As the father of a daughter who competes in basketball and soccer, at a very young age, you immediately see the difference when boys and girls play together. There's a decided biological difference in terms of strength, speed, and this is just simple common sense. I can't say it any more eloquently than Ms. Houchin did, and I yield back.
The gentleman gets back. The chair thanks the gentleman. Thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. If there are no other questions from the dais, the witnesses are excused.
Thank you very much.